Hello dears, I hope you all are fine and okay. So today we are going to talk about Elizabethan poetry. When we talk of Elizabethan poetry, the first thing that comes to our mind is sonnet, right? Poem of 14 lines. Sonnet. Um, Sonnet was imported from abroad. It originated in Italy with Dante, right? And then Petrarch developed sonnets, right? Um, in England, if we talk about sonnets, so in England, um, sonnets came with White, right? Um, his sonnets were published in Totale's Miscellany in 1557, and White was inspired by Petrarch, right? So Petrarchan sonnet was of obviously of 14 lines, but it had two stanzas. The first of 8 lines, that is octave, and the second of 6 lines, that was sestet, right? So after the octave, the ninth line is what known as volta, right? The Earl of Surrey, his poems were also published in Totale's Miscellany after his death. Surrey brought innovation. All right. He brought innovation in Petrarchan sonnet. His sonnets had 3 quatrains and a couplet, right? Like 4, then 4, then 4, then 2. And this was also followed by Shakespeare, and later they were known as Shakespearean sonnets, right? The rhyming scheme was also different of Surrey's sonnet and of Shakespeare's sonnet, right? Okay, let's talk about poets of Elizabethan era. The first poet that we are going to talk about is Michael Drayton. Michael Drayton was most voluminous. His chief work is Polyolbion. Right? It was a big poem, an enormous poem of 1,000 couplets, more than 1,000 couplets, and it described the geographical beauty of Britain, and it also talked about the legends that were connected with Britain, right? One of his poems, the Battle the Battle of the Battle of Agincourt is a famous ballad, and it was also used by Tennyson for his poem Charge of the Light Brigade, right? We see bravery of the English in this poem, right? And it also talks about the noble ancestors, right? Okay, the second poet of this era was Edmund Spencer, a very well-known writer, a very well-known poet. Edmund Spencer. Um, he was also a sonneteer, a famous sonneteer. Right? After Chaucer, after 2 centuries of Chaucer's death, uh, Spenser came on the scene as a breakthrough in English poetry, right? Spenser as a breakthrough in English poetry. If we compare Edmund Spencer with Geoffrey Chaucer, we see that Chaucer writes about humans as they are, while Spencer he writes about human as they should be, right? He writes about them as they should be. Clear? He's an idealist. Chaucer makes use of healthy humor, but Spenser doesn't, right? As his main aim is not to entertain, but to reform, right? Not to entertain, but to reform. Chaucer's excellence is in his observation, and Spenser's excellence is in his imagination, right? Okay. Spenser's poetry has perfect melody, rare sense of beauty, and we've already written it, imagination, but his imagination is quite splendid imagination. There are heroes, knights, demons, and renaissance, all in one lofty sense of morality and seriousness, right? He's got many famous works, right? One of his famous works is Fairy Queen, and but it's kind of fact that his fame rests upon this work. Spenser is famous for Fairy Queen. His original plan was to write 24 books, but he only managed to write 6 books, right? So in these 6 books, he includes holiness, temperance, chastity, friendship, justice, courtesy. If you go for the first book of Fairy Queen, the Red Cross Knight presents holiness. In the first book, the Red Cross Knight represents holiness, right? And Una represents religion, right? fairy queen represents Queen Elizabeth, and Duessa represents Queen Mary. Right? That's how he works with his splendid imagination. Right? His other work is the Shepherd's Calendar. The Shepherd's Calendar. It was a pastoral romance. It has 12 pastoral poems based on 12 months of the year, right? Okay. Spenser, for his good work, he earned the title of the English Virgil, right? And he earned this after his like he wrote a lot, but after the Fairy Queen and the Shepherd's Calendar, right? Many poets followed him. Many writers said used lots of good words for him, right? He was also called as the second father of English poetry, but he could not influence his people because the spirit of the age was not poetry at that time, it was drama, right? He was well read in ancient classics, and therefore he took inspiration from Homer. He was also one of those poets who were brilliant at imagination and craftsmanship, right? He was there is a saying about him that he was the most he's the most poetical poet. The most poetical poet, right? And that is the reason that he was known as the poet's poet. Right? He was later followed by John Keats, by Tennyson, right, and by many others, right? Okay. The next author, the next poet that we are going to talk about is Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney, a very famous name in English literature. Philip Sidney. Sidney is considered as the ideal gentleman. He stood as a symbol for personal honor and national greatness, right? He wrote his first pastoral romance named Arcadia. Right? And it sings of rural life and its beauty, and it was then imitated by lots of people, right? His other work includes Astrophil and Stella. Astrophil and Stella, right? Astrophil and Stella was a collection of songs and sonnets, right? And he in this Astrophil and Stella is the collection of songs and sonnets, and it was addressed to Lady Penelope, to whom Sidney was betrothed. She becomes Stella, star, and Sidney was Astrophil. Astrophil is the lover of the star, right? So Stella was star and Astrophil was the lover of that star, right? But unfortunately, she was married to another person, and Sidney married another girl, right? Okay. This Astrophil Stella is the voice of his broken heart, right? He also had another important work, an apology for poetry. An apology for poetry. It's also known as the defense of poesy. Defense of poesy. Poesy is the art of writing poetry, right? Stephen Gosson he criticized poetry, and Sidney wrote in response to Stephen Gosson, right? If we talk about his pattern of writing sonnet, so it is different from both from Petrarch and from Surrey. His rhyming scheme is also different, and the way he writes sonnet is also different, right? The next poet is Samuel Daniel. Samuel Daniel. Samuel Daniel was the one who got inspired by Philip Sidney and his revival of sonnets, right? He wrote Delia. Delia was an address to Sidney's sister, right? He also in this he talks about the cruel refusal of Sidney's sister and her interest in other guys, right? Okay. He writes about himself that I say no more, I fear I said too much, right? So he is kind of prolix, right? Okay. Then we have other sonneteers as well, like we have Henry Constable, we have Shakespeare, I forgot Shakespeare. Shakespeare is another sonneteer. Let us talk about him. Um, well known to everyone, Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets. And in these 154, the first 126 are addressed to a young man who is believed to be William Herbert, and the next 26 are addressed to a dark lady who has betrayed Shakespeare for another young man, right? Okay. In Shakespeare's sonnet, we see that Shakespeare is unlocking his heart, right? His sonnets are the expressions of his heart. He uses a rhyming scheme which was used by Surrey. It is A B A B, C D C D, E F E F, and G G, right? Although his sonnets tell the story of his heart, of his broken heart, of the mishaps that happened to him, right? The last two lines, the last couplet of his sonnet, closes with optimism, which restores his faith in love, right? Okay, so that's about Elizabethan poetry, about different Elizabethan poets. I'll see you with other features of Elizabethan era in the next lecture. Thank you very much.